Factory Committees and the Dictatorship of the Proletariat by Maurice Brinton. It is a welcome sign of the times that a serious exchange of radical opinion is now underway concerning the formative period of the Russian state, and the journal Critique is to be congratulated on having played a part in the initiation of this discussion. How deep the confrontation goes will, of course, depend on how open the journal remains to those in the revolutionary movement who do not accept the label of, quote, Marxist, end quote, but who feel they may nevertheless have something of relevance to contribute. In your last issue, Chris Goody claims that, quote, it is only the current practice and experience of the world movement for socialist revolution that is beginning to allow us an overall view of the battle stations which we have unthinkingly maintained for a long time, end quote. In a very general sense, that is, of course, true, but elements of a serious critique antedated, and by a considerable period, May 68 in France, the Prague events, and the Chilean Revolution. Some of those who initiated this critique would moreover shudder to find themselves subsumed under the we that Goody refers to. They did not wait until the late 60s to express their views. As early as 1918, they had clearly seen the direction in which Russian society was moving and proclaimed a principled opposition, often at the cost of their lives. It is a tragic fact for which Leninists of all kinds, Stalinists, Trotskyists, Maoists, and the advocates of other theories of, quote, state capitalism, end quote, i.e. international socialists, Bordigists, and, quote, Marxist humanists, end quote, etc., must carry their full share of responsibility. We know less today about the early weeks of the Russian Revolution than we do, for instance, about the history of the Paris Commune. Quote, unfortunately, it's not the workers who write history. It is always, quote, the others, end quote, end quote. Cornelius Castoriadis from Bolshevism to Bureaucracy. Quote, official, end quote, historians seldom have eyes to see or ears to hear the acts and words which express the autonomous activity of the working class. Official historians think in terms of institutions, congresses, leaders. In the best instances, official historians will vaunt rank-and-file activity as long as that rank-and-file activity coincides with their own conceptions. But official historians, quote, will radically condemn it or impute the basis of motives to it as soon as it deviates from that line, end quote. Castoriadis. They seem to lack the categories of thought necessary to perceive life as it really is. To them, an activity which has no leader or program, no institution, and no statutes can only be conceptualized as, quote, troubles, quote, disorder, quote, anarchy. In the words of Cardan, Cornelius Castoriadis, quote, the spontaneous activity of the masses belongs by definition to what history suppresses, end quote. Goody is correct when he claims that it is, quote, part of the revolutionary process to demystify our own history, end quote. And when Goody points out that the struggle for, quote, direct forms of working people's power at the point of production, end quote, has been, quote, hidden and ignored, end quote. The formulation in the passive is, however, disingenuous. By whom was it hidden and why was it ignored? But he is profoundly wrong when he attributes this silence of the, quote, Marxist left, end quote, to such ideological shortcomings as lack of, quote, temerity, end quote, or insufficient, quote, capacity for self-criticism, end quote. A proper evaluation of these matters cannot but lead for anyone with even moderate pretensions to intellectual honesty to a complete break with Leninism in all its aspects and to re-examine certain basic Marxist beliefs. A steady trickle of documentation is now coming to light concerning the role of the factory committees in the Russian Revolution, such as Carr's The Bolshevik Revolution, 1917-23, Daniel's The Conscience of the Revolution, published in 1960, Averich's Russian Anarchists, published in 1967, and Kaplan's Bolshevik Ideology, published in 1969, provide an excellent starting point for anyone interested in the discussion. End footnote. Goody sees these committees as, quote, the most powerful institution in Russia by the end of 1917, end quote, and in this he is certainly right. Goody is also correct in claiming that, quote, this power later submerged, end quote. What is lacking in his article, however, is the serious attempt to explain what happened in between, when it happened and why it happened and to whom it happened. The, quote, submergence, end quote, of which Goody speaks was well advanced, if not virtually completed. By May 1918, i.e. before the Civil War and the, quote, Allied intervention really got underway, the traditional explanation of the degeneration of the Russian Revolution are just not good enough. The explanations of the degeneration of the Russian Revolution are just not good enough. In my view, Goody's silence on these essential questions is unavoidable. It flows directly from his honestly declared political position. He sees party and state as, quote, indirect forms of workers' power, end quote, and explicitly absolves the Leninist Party from any blame in the degeneration. He claims that, quote, even in our present world, in spite of the fact that the bureaucratic degeneration is inherent in the, quote, workers' state, end quote, and the, quote, workers' party, end quote, these are still the necessary complement to forms of direct workers' power, end quote. Goody only conceives these forms of direct workers' power as, quote, effective antibodies against that degeneration, end quote. Goody nowhere posits them as the necessarily dominant units in the initiation of policy. In other words, as the basic nuclei of the new society. With this kind of overall outlook, a serious analysis of the smashing of the factory committees is virtually impossible, for the Bolshevik Party was to play a dominant role in this tragedy. There is nothing more utopian than the belief that the Russian working class could have maintained its power through a, quote, workers' party, end quote, or a, quote, workers' state, end quote, when it had already lost that power at the point of production. I have elsewhere, in the Bolsheviks and Workers Control 1917 to 1921, which is also on this YouTube channel, sought to bring together material from disparate sources and to document as concisely and yet as fully as possible the various stages of process which led within the short period of 4 years from the tremendous upsurge of the factory committee movement, a movement which both implicitly and explicitly sought to alter the relations of production, to the establishment of unquestioned domination by a monolithic and bureaucratic agency, the party, over all aspects of economical and political life. I argue that as this agency was not itself based on production, its rule could only epitomize the continued limitation of the authority of the workers in the productive process. This necessarily implied the perpetuation within society at large. It is impossible within the space available to recapitulate all the evidence here. The first stage of the process under discussion was the subordination of the factory committees to the All-Russian Council for Workers' Control, in which the unions, themselves already strongly under party influence, were heavily represented. This took place very shortly after the coming to power of the Soviet government. The second phase, which almost immediately followed the first, was the incorporation of this All-Russian Council for Workers' Control into the Vysenka, Supreme Economic Council, even more heavily weighed in favor of the unions, but also comprising direct nominees of the state, i.e. of the party. By early 1918, the Bolsheviks were actively seeking to merge the committees into the trade union structures. The issues provoked heated discussions at the first All-Russian Congress of Trade Unions from January 17th to 14th, 1918, which saw desperate attempts, led mainly by anarcho-syndicalists, to maintain the autonomy of the committees against the advice David Ryazanov, who urged the committees, quote, to commit suicide by becoming an integral element of the trade union structure, end quote. During The next 2 years, a sustained campaign was waged to curb the power of the unions themselves. For the unions, albeit in a very indirect and distorted way, could still be influenced by the working class. It was particularly important that for the new bureaucracy to replace this power by the authority of the direct party nominees. These managers and administrators, nearly all appointed from above, gradually came to form the basis of a new ruling class. The important point as far as the reevaluation of history is concerned is that each of these steps was to be resisted, but each fight was to be lost. Each time the, quote, adversary, end quote, appeared in the garb of new, quote, proletarian, end quote, power, and each defeat was to make it more difficult for the working class itself directly to manage production, i.e. fundamentally to alter its status as a subordinate class. Sorry, 1 second. I want to make sure I'm recording. Really scared of doing that. Goody claims that, quote, the essence of the libertarian argument is that the level of the productive forces plays a less determining role in the development of history than the existence of hierarchy in the revolutionary process. That hierarchy takes the form of, quote, authoritarianism, end quote, among leaders, in this case the Bolshevik party, and, quote, false consciousness, end quote, among the masses in submitting to what they consider their natural leaders, end quote. It is difficult to know from where he can derive such a crudely psychological formulation of the libertarian case. As far as I know, no libertarian has argued that the level of the productive forces is either, quote, more or, quote, less important than the role of ideas and attitudes in influencing historical development. Both are important. What libertarians have stressed and most Marxists have signally refused to recognize is that the conceptions and attitudes of the dominant party were as much an objective fact of history, influencing the evolution of events at critical moments, as were productive statistics for electricity or steel. Goody claims that the libertarian argument, quote, can be nailed quite easily, end quote, and I find it a compliment that he should choose my essay on which to practice his skills as a carpenter. He focuses attention on one particular episode I describe in the hope that by challenging its factual accuracy he can somehow impugn the credibility of the rest. He correctly defines the area of the discussion. Quote, the argument is that Lenin and Bolshevik leaders suppressed the factory committees immediately on the seizure of power because they held too much real power. End quote. Right on. Goody is also correct in attributing to me the view, quote, the legislation on workers' control immediately after October was elaborated in totally different ways by Lenin and by the committees, end quote. The committee's leaders, end quote. Again, right on. There's abundant evidence summarized in my text to substantiate this view. The Achilles heel of my thesis is allegedly my reference to a document drawn up by certain members of the Central Council of Petrograd factory committees on how the economy should have been run immediately after the October events. I am quite prepared to take up the challenge on this rather narrow basis. According to Goody, and he devotes 3 pages to the matter, my knowledge of the document in question was, quote, fifth hand, end quote. I had inherited from one Didier Limon, quote, an amputated quotation bearing the wrong date, wrong title, and wrong authors, end quote. I had then, quote, rewritten the text, end quote, strong enough. Unfortunately, on every single point, Goody is wrong. Sorry. Looking at a footnote if there's anything worth saying. Nope. According to Goody, the faithful history of this document was as follows. It was originally published in part in Izvestia, December 17th, 1917, and fully in Narodno Koziestvo, number 1, 1918. Lazovsky, a Bolshevik trade unionist, allegedly altered its title from, quote, Draft Instructions on Workers' Control, end quote, quote, practical manual for the execution of workers' control, end quote. This was done in his book, Rebochi Control, which according to Goody was written in, quote, November of 1917, end quote. Goody does not explain how Lazovsky could, in November 1917, have been distorting the title of a text that had not yet been published, but this is a minor point. Then still, according to Goody's chronology, Pankratova took up the text in her writings of 1923. For reasons of her own, she dated it February 6, 1918, i.e. after the first trade union Congress, which sought to, quote, fuse from above, end quote, the factory committees and the unions. Goody is to be congratulated in detecting this early piece of falsification by one of Stalin's pet historians. But the relevance of this to what either Limon or I wrote totally escapes me. Neither of us gave the wrong date for the text under discussion. According to Goody, Limon takes over from Pankratova, quote, the wrong title and the wrong date and adds his own embellishments, end quote. He truncates a quotation in the text and changes the authorship of the original document, attributing it to the, quote, non-Bolshevik leaders of the All-Russian Council of the Factory Committees, end quote. On all these scores, Goody is wrong. Limon did not get his facts via Pankratova. The, quote, secret, end quote, can now be let out of the bag. Limon got his facts from someone who had seen the documentation at first hand and before Pankratova had even thought of writing about it. I have also seen this original source. Even Goody could have access to it, had he been less concerned in proving the bad faith of those he disagrees with politically, and had he chosen to check with Limon. Limon is, after all, on the editorial board of Autogestion, paper for which Goody is the, quote, correspondent for Great Britain, end quote. The, quote, original, end quote, source is Chapter 8. Les Souvenirs de Usine l'Ouvre. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Of Max Horschiller's book, Les Mirages Soviétiques. Horschiller was a French revolutionary who spoke Russian well. The authenticity of his account is vouched for by no less a figure than André Meerheim, who wrote the preface to Horschiller's book. It was, in fact, at Meerheim's suggestion that Horschiller went to Russia. Now, what does Horschiller say as to the authorship, the title, and the content of the controversial document? Footnote. Meerheim, one-time secretary of the French Metal Workers Federation and author of the Authors' Amain, he was one of the important figures of the anti-war movement in France during the First World War. Meerheim was an active participant in the Zimmerwald Conference of Anti-War Socialists. End footnote. I don't know if I'm pronouncing this guy's name right, because I've heard of the sociologist Emil Durkheim's name pronounced Durkheim, which if you type in Durkheim in the French to English translator and you ask it to pronounce it, I think it does in fact say Durkheim. So maybe this guy's name is Meerheim, but who knows? End of footnote anyway. Now, what does Horschiller say as to the authorship, the title, and the content of the controversial document? Horschiller makes it clear that in the weeks preceding the revolution, it was the anarchists who were striking the tune in the factory committees, and that the Bolsheviks could only trail along after them. On December 7, 1917, the decree setting up the Vyshenka Supreme Economic Council was promulgated. The Vyshenka comprised some members of the All-Russian Council of Workers Control, a very indirect sop to the factory committees, massive representation of all the new commissariats and a number of experts nominated from above in consultative capacity. According to Hochschild, the leaders of the factory committees, dissatisfied with Lenin's concessions, did not implement the decisions but elaborated their own decree in the form of a, quote, practical manual for the implementation of workers' control, end quote. Hochschild describes how jealously he had kept the 8 great in-folio sheets printed in double columns distributed in the streets of Petrograd. He has clearly seen the original, which is more than can be said with any confidence of Lazovsky, Pankratova, or even of Goody. Goody then takes issue with Limon's attribution of this text to, quote, non-Bolshevik leaders at the All-Russian Council of Factory Committees, end quote. Is he really suggesting that the, quote, manual, end quote, was a party document? Reference to Hochschild text shows that it was no such thing. One particular prescription of the, quote, manual, end quote, epitomizes this point. The, quote, manual, end quote, spoke of, quote, regional federations of factory committees, end quote, and of the need for a, quote, national union of factory committees, end quote. But even Deutscher is forced to point out that such demands were diametrically opposed to party policy of the time. Quote, a few weeks after the upheaval of the factory committees attempted to form their own national organization, the Bolsheviks now called upon the trade unions to render a special service to the nascent Soviet state and to discipline the factory committees. The unions came out firmly against the attempt of the factory committees to form a national organization of their own. The unions prevented the convocation of a planned all-Russian Congress of factory committees, end quote. Isaac Deutscher, Soviet Trade Unions. It ill behooves various Bolsheviks, after all this, to denounce the factory committees as only having had parochial preoccupations. 2 other facts stress the wide divergence of approach already obvious at this stage between the Leninists and the leaders of the factory committees. The very real difficulties Lenin experienced in getting wide support for his, quote, draft decree on workers' control, end quote. These were originally published in Pravda on November 3, 1917, but only ratified by the VTSIK, All-Russian Central Executive Committee of the Soviets 11 days later, after heated opposition from the rank and file of the factory committees. Footnote. According to Carr, in the Bolshevik Revolution, Volume 2, published in 1966, quote, in the controversy behind the scenes which followed the publication of Lenin's draft, the trade unions became the unexpected champions of order, discipline, and centralized direction of production, and the revised draft decree finally represented to VTSIK on 14th to 27th November 1917 was the result of a struggle between the trade unions and the factory committees, which repeated the struggle at the October conference, end quote. End of footnote. Secondly, the fact that Izvestia, December 13th, 1917, found it necessary to publish a text, General Instructions on Workers' Control in conformity with the decree of November 14th, which became widely known as the, quote, countermanual, end quote. Concerning the substance of the passage under dispute, Hochschild's text makes it crystal clear that Limon has, quote, amputated, end quote, nothing. Quoting from the introduction to the, quote, manual, end quote, Hochschild writes the workers' control ne doit pas être considéré dans les seins étroits d'une vision, mais dans les seins plus larges de ingérence. End quote. I don't know what that means, and it doesn't look like there's an English translation. Full stop, a full stop put by Hochschild, not by Limon, and a reasonable place. I would have thought at which to end a quotation, that my own reference to this document included, through the carelessness of a misplaced unquote, a few words that were Limon's hardly constitutes, quote, rewriting the text, end quote, and alters precisely nothing to the substance of the matter. So there you have it. No plot, no, quote, fifth-hand knowledge, end quote, of a, quote, shop-soiled, end quote, quotation. No Lazovsky as the, quote, evident, end quote, original secondary source of all the rest. No wrong dates inherited from Pankratova. No Limon changing the authorship of the document. No truncating of quotations. All these are figments of Goody's imagination, and he should clearly stop prattling about, quote, attitudes to verifiable facts, end quote. If this is really the best your contributor can do to, quote, nail, end quote, the libertarian argument, those who manufacture bandages for sore thumbs are in for a boom. Let us return to the main argument. Goody claims that, quote, if there was a nascent bureaucracy in 1917, then the factory committees were part of that nascent bureaucracy, end quote. This is totally to misunderstand the concept of bureaucracy. It attributes to the word a restricted meaning of little value to those who seek radically to change society. The classical Marxist conceptions are here totally inadequate. A bureaucracy is not just, quote, officialdom, end quote, or a, quote, social stratum enjoying certain material privileges, end quote, or a, quote, gendarme ensuring a certain pattern of distribution under conditions of want, end quote. If the concept of self-management is to have any meaning, a bureaucracy must be seen as a group seeking to manage from outside the activities of others. If that group has a monopoly of decisional authority, its bureaucratic potential will be vastly enhanced. In this sense, if there was a nascent bureaucracy by the end of 1917 in Russia, it was certainly not to be found in the factory committees. It was to be found in the party itself. Certain party attitudes here played a very important role. Trotsky himself, if we must refer to him, perceptively described all this. Referring to the Third Party Congress, April 25th to May 10th, 1905, Trotsky spoke of, quote, the young revolutionary bureaucrat already emerging as a type. They were far more intransigent and severe with the revolutionary working men than with themselves, preferring to domineer, end quote. Trotsky in his biography of Stalin. No less a man than Lenin had written that, quote, a worker agitator who shows any talent should not work in the factory, end quote. Is it in any case, is it any wonder that these conceptions, the party soon, is it any wonder that with these conceptions, the party soon lost all contact with the class? Goody seeks to prove his point that the factory committees belong to the nascent bureaucracy by looking at the later careers of certain factory committees leaders, such as Chubar, Matvei, Zhivatov, and Skripnik. That non-Bolshevik leaders of the factory committees later supported the Bolsheviks is undisputable. But so what? It is not unknown for individual shop stewards to end up as foremen. Does this really prove anything beyond the capacity of established power in its various garbs to recuperate dissent? Does the fact that Alexandra Kollontai later became a Stalinist ambassador invalidate Kollontais' earlier writings on the emancipation of women? Does Trotsky's later Bolshevism invalidate his prophetic warnings of 1904 on the subject of the party substituting itself for the working class? If Goody is really interested in the history of what happened in the personnel of the factory committees, and not to just a few of their leaders, a fruitful area might be the history of the various syndicalist groups, and in particular of the, quote, revolutionary center of factory committees, end quote, a body of anarchist inspiration which competed for a while with the All-Russian Council of Factory Committees without ever succeeding in supplanting it. So many were the obstacles put in its path. The search will, I suspect, prove disappointing. Systematic persecution of, quote, left, end quote, dissidents soon became a way of life. Proletarian partisans of the individual factory committees tried to resist, and to regroup, but their resistance was easily overcome. The search also might encompass the fate of groupings of Bolshevik origin, such as Myasnikov's workers' group, an offspring of the workers' opposition, and Bogdanov's workers' truth. One fact such a search will reveal, and of this there can be little doubt, is that this group had perceived as early as 1921, without the privilege of hindsight, and far more clearly than does Chris Goody, that the, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote, had been liquidated pari passu with the liquidation of the factory committees. Essay published in the journal Critique, number 4, 1975.